play here. Because what we have seen is, in contradistinction to the rights which most of us would support, is the birth of a human rights industry, with human rights departments springing up all over campuses, with big names becoming, I'm not saying that they're sort of, all of them are doing the same thing, but by and large, if you look at some of the big names who are professors for human rights, one such name occurs at the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard, Michael Ignatieff. When news was brought to this Nobel professor that there was torture in Iraq, and what did he think about it? He said, I would have to think about that. Finally, he came down on the right side, I'm glad to say, and said it shouldn't happen. But then soon after, he wrote a book on ethics in which he actually said, well, you know, one can't be totally squeamish about these things. And Saddam Hussein tortured too. Well, yeah, he did. And the Saudi kings do it too, and the president of Egypt does it too, but one doesn't like it when they do it. And other dictators have done it in the past. But if you have a system which is pledged to stop this, then you can't do it yourselves in this particular way. I mean, I could then use other arguments if I wanted to and say, yeah, but the torture in Iraq was horrible, but it wasn't as bad as the torture they used in Vietnam. There was an American soldier recently, last summer, at a festival in Chicago where they were discussing the iconography of Abu Ghraib, as if that's the main thing to discuss, the pictures. And this angry former GI stood up. He was sitting in the audience, and when it was time for questions, he couldn't bear it. And he said, look, what are you guys going on about? I was in Nam, and I saw the following thing happen in front of my eyes. We captured 2 Vietnamese prisoners, guerrillas who were fighting against us. We wanted information from them. They refused to speak. He said, in front of my eyes, the officer ordered a soldier with his knife to cut the stomach of one of these prisoners and take out his entrails. And then we said to the other soldier, this is going to happen to you if you don't talk. And he didn't talk, and so we did it to him as well. So he said, when you occupy countries, that's what you become. You become animals. And so let's not talk about iconography. Let's talk about torture. And this should never become acceptable again. And I don't know how many of you have been following the trial of Padilla, who was kept in a brig off Carolina. The trial has now come up, and the forms of sensory deprivation used on him have driven him completely crazy. So he can barely defend himself, according to the reports being published in the New York Times. It's a very important trial. Likewise, Guantanamo. Most of the people, it now appears, had nothing to do with anything, but were picked up because they happened to be in the wrong country at the wrong time. Some of them have been released, others have been tortured. The Brits have done exactly the same thing in Britain, driven people, locked up people, deprived them of everything, so that the bulk of them have literally lost their minds and are now in mental institutions. Now, what is this in aid of? To fight terrorism? But you know, you can't fight terrorism like that. I remember very well, after the terrorist attacks, when both the President and the British Prime Minister said, these terrorists want to destroy our way of life and we're not going to let them. But you have let them. And in fact, they didn't ask you for this. Because awful though these events were, it's not that they were completely crazy. They said, you're occupying our countries, get out. This is not the way to do it, as one told them many a time, by going and killing innocents in the United States. But that's what they wanted. It's not the system here that they were particularly opposed to, apart from the way in which it refracted on their lives and in their countries. But the attacks which have been made, the Patriot Act here. In Britain, we have an act in place now which makes it possible for anyone to be picked up and kept without a in prison without seeing a lawyer for 4 to 6 weeks. And they're still saying that that's not enough. And they had to introduce a state of emergency to pick up some people they didn't like. And in order to get the state of emergency, they said we are facing a more difficult situation in Britain than we did during the Second World War. A blatant lie. But they said it in order to get these wretched laws through. So the very idea of all this going on at the same time as human rights being used as an ideology is, of course, deeply disturbing.